neighbors here in upstate New York, where I have been for the past 43 years, actually. I came to Cornell in 1971 and I've been there ever since. I sometimes tell people in the South I moved from southern Appalachia to northern Appalachia. Everybody in Ithaca is not happy with that, that description of the area, but they are similar actually. The mountains are very similar, and a lot of the people, if you get back, away from Ithaca, away from the city, it looks familiar. I thought I would talk about my latest novel, The Road from Gap Creek, tonight, and maybe read one poem also. In 1999, I published a novel called Gap Creek, loosely based on stories about my maternal grandparents, whom I had known when I was little, and they were quite old. It was a tough story. Couple, Hank and Julie, get married on Mount Olivet, North Carolina, moved down to Gap Creek in South Carolina, where they have a horrendous year, fire, flood, sickness, con men. When my friend Fred Chappell read the book, he wrote me that you should have called that book Job Had It Easy. There were so many troubles. A woman out in California wrote me and said, if anything good ever happens to Julie, would you write me and let me know? And, another woman wrote, when I finished that book, I ran to my refrigerator just to see all the good food in it. I gave a talk about it at Kindle of Ithaca, retirement community, and a lady came up afterward. I could tell she was moved by the story. She said, how dare you put those young people through so much misery? And I said, that's the best review I've gotten. It seemed absolutely real to her. Well, the book was printed in an edition, I think, of 10,000 copies. It got wonderful reviews in the New York Times and other newspapers, and sold out the first edition and went into a small second printing. And came the new year. Remember when all that hoopla about the new century, the new millennium, all that talk in 2000. One snowy afternoon, my phone rang. And I answered it, and this woman said, all in a rush, it's true what they say on the back of your book. It's the work of a master. That's the kind of talk we writers like to hear. So I said, well, thank you. She didn't introduce herself. She said, no, I mean it. Your book is so intense. It's so vivid. I couldn't put it down. And I assumed she was talking about Gap Creek. She hadn't actually named that. She called it your book. She said, tell me, what does Massena really die of in the first chapter? I had to say to this unknown woman, he chokes to death on worms. This terrible scene. It's the only really true scene in the book, by the way. My grandmother's younger brother was called Massena, and he really did die that way. And after the book was published, I got letters from descendants of the doctor who had treated him. They had heard that story about the little boy carried down the mountain to the doctor who died on the way back up the mountain. Well, this woman on the phone said, I have a book club I would like for you to visit. I had decided by that point that this was somebody of either Spartanburg or Greenville, South Carolina. I had met on book tour the fall before, and I thought I'll just be polite. I said, well, I'll be happy to visit your book club when I'm back in the area. She said, well, where are you? And I said, upstate New York. And she said, oh, you're up north. I'm up north too. I'm in Chicago. And I recognized Oprah Winfrey's voice at that point. I said, you have made my day. And she said, I'd like to do that. She never introduced herself. I had to recognize her voice. I don't watch a lot of television, but I had heard her voice. Hung up the phone, and I said to my wife, you won't believe who that was on the telephone. That was Oprah Winfrey. And my wife said, oh, don't you think somebody's playing a prank on you? I thought, yeah, somebody at a bar in downtown Ithaca is having a real good laugh right now. But the phone rang again. And it was the producer of the Oprah show. making arrangements for me to fly out to Chicago to be on the show and to fly down to South Carolina to take an interview on Gap Creek, which is a real place. It was the place where my grandparents lived early in their marriage. I began to believe it. And when I hung up the phone that time, my wife said, how many copies do you think that will sell? Well, I had heard of the Oprah Book of the Month Club. That's what it was called back then. And the Book of the Month Club, and I thought, well, I've heard that the Book of the Month Club sells 20,000 copies. And, for somebody who starts out in poetry and short story writing, 20,000 copies is a lot of copies. I was thrilled. The next morning, my publisher calls and says, we have to have 600,000 copies of the hardcover in bookstores by next Monday before Oprah announces on her show on Tuesday. As everybody rushed out to buy books after she announced the book, I began to get some idea of the scale of the Oprah Book Club. I did fly out to Chicago and retake the show. People always ask me what Oprah was like, and did I like Oprah? And I say, yes, I liked Oprah. She actually was very nice, and her film crew that did the interview down in South Carolina, it just seemed like ordinary people. It was hard to remember that this was national television. The whole thing was so easy. At the taping of the show, I sat there, and people said all these nice things about my book, and asked questions, and I just smiled and nodded, and had a wonderful time. And then we moved to the other side of the sound stage where Oprah had this fancy dinner table, all kinds of candles and plates and many knives and forks, and a French chef had fixed the dinner. Well, we just spent an hour talking about my book, and I thought, okay, we'll move over there and continue talking about my book. And I sat down, and Oprah came rushing in and said, therapists tell me that the thing women complain about most is having to have sex with their husbands. I couldn't think of anything to say. These women sitting around the table kept talking, and finally Oprah looked over and said, well, Robert's not saying anything. And I said, well, I'm taking notes for my next book. Anyway, it was wonderful. I mean, eventually Gap Creek sold about 2 million copies, thanks mostly to Oprah. It became a bestseller in Germany, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and I got all these wonderful, wonderful fan letters. What Oprah gave me was readers. I mean, I've never had so many readers, and it spilled over into the other books also. But, I'd never sold more than, I guess, 10,000 copies of the book before that. But my other books began to sell better. But almost from the day Gap Creek was published, I got letters, emails from readers saying, is there going to be a sequel? Because people felt that story was not complete. That true Hank and Julie had made it back up into North Carolina at the end of it. And they were expecting a baby. But everybody wanted to know what happened next. And I agreed. I told everybody I was going to write a sequel. But I was in the middle of another novel at that time. What became This Rock, which is a sequel to the novel The Truest Pleasure, about the Powell family. And when I finished that, I knew I had to finish a novel about the revolution in the South, which became Brave Enemy. And then my publisher called me up and said, we want to move into nonfiction publishing. We're primarily known as a fiction publisher, but we want to do nonfiction. By the way, nonfiction sells better than fiction. There's no doubt if you're at the top of the bestseller list in nonfiction, you're probably selling more copies of the #1 position in fiction. So my publisher said, would you like to do a nonfiction book? And I said, well, maybe. And he said, what would you like to do? And I said, maybe a biography. And they said, oh, whom? I said, maybe Daniel Boone. I spent 4 years researching, going around the country wherever Daniel Boone had lived or hunted, camped, going to archives, published Boone, a biography in 2007, and it really took off, unlike any book I've ever published. It sold out so that there were no copies in bookstores on the book tour. People would get very angry. They had come to buy a book to get it signed, and there were no books. It became a national bestseller. My publisher was very happy and wanted me to do a sequel, which I did. The Lions of the West, Heroes and Villains of the Western Expansion came out in 2011. But I knew I had to get back to Hank and Julie's story. Now, when I came down to do that interview with the Oprah film crew, I knew my mother was going to say something about Gap Creek. I knew she had read it, and it's based on stories she had told me to a great extent. But she didn't say anything. And I knew she was going to say something. Just as I was leaving for the airport to go back to Ithaca, she said, "When are you going to write about me?" You never know how family will respond to a work. Instead of getting mad, I mean, I left her out. She felt I hadn't. She passed away at the age of 98 in 2010. And almost the day after her death, I started writing the sequel to Gap Creek because I knew it would be narrated by the daughter of Hank and Julie, and it would be about the next generation. Julia had her say in Gap Creek, and I think most authors will tell you that once you do a voice and you do it intensely, it's later hard to get back into that voice, and when you've done it. That's happened to me in poetry. I wrote a poem called Mockingbird, published 40 years ago, and some people think it's my finest poem, and they wonder why I haven't followed up with others like it, but I simply can't get back into that voice. My fiction is voice-driven, and once I hear the voice of the narrator, I can write it. It can take me a long time to get that voice. And oddly enough, almost all my fiction has been narrated by women characters. The greatest breakthrough I ever had as a fiction writer in 1989, when I was trying to write a story about World War II, the 8th Air Force, B-17s, and the life and death of my Uncle Robert in a B-17 crash. I had done so much research. I'd interviewed pilots and navigators and bombardiers. I'd been to England, found the site of the crash. I knew everything about the routes they took into Germany and back, that sort of thing. Couldn't get started. And one day I said, I will create a fiancé for the soldier and let her tell part of the story. And it was so scary to think of writing from the point of view of a woman. What did I know about how she would remember these things and feel about them? And I said, I will become like an actor. I will erase myself and try to give everything to this character. Her voice, her values, her fears, her pleasures that are the essence of the fiction. It's the most important lesson I ever learned about writing fiction. Eudora Welty says, sometimes we create our best characters by accident, but most often by going farthest from ourselves. And I know exactly what she means by that. To get into the fictive world, you're not writing autobiography. You're creating a fictive world, and once you get into that imagination, and for me, once you get that voice, it unfolds. And once I started writing The Road from Gap Creek, I was so excited I could hardly wait to get up in the morning to see what Annie would tell me about the family. It was like I was learning from her. I was just writing it down. Many fiction writers will tell you they have that experience. It's like they're just a stenographer or they're narrating almost. Of course, it's in your imagination. But I found that one secret to good fiction writing is that you have to humble yourself to learn from your characters how to tell their story. In my years at the university, I've known a lot of very smart people, literary critics, literary theorists, and people who can't write fiction worth a damn. Almost as though they're too smart to write fiction. You have to give yourself to your characters and their world and their problems, how they deal with their problems to write the story. The Road from Gap Creek begins in 1943, November 1943. when the family get a telegram saying their favorite son or brother has been killed in a B-17 crash in England. And the fictive present is how they deal with that tragic news. I grew up hearing about that. My uncle was killed before I was born, but he was very much a presence. And he is part of the inspiration for the story. But then Annie circles back and tells the story of the family from the time they came from Gap Creek up to Green River in North Carolina, survived the great flu epidemic just after World War I, the typhoid epidemic, the Roaring Twenties, and the Great Depression, and of course then World War II. I thought what I would do tonight is read 4 very short excerpts from the novel to give you a sense of the narration, of the voice. Now, Annie is a very different narrator from Julie of Gap Creek. She's somewhat better educated, but she's also much more confident of her voice. Part of the challenge of writing Gap Creek was that Julie is not very well educated and is not confident of her voice. That was a real challenge. It took me a long time to sort of get that. And I start here by talking about how Julie, that's the mother, that's Mama, washes her porch off every day, scours it, gets rid of the chicken piles and the dirt, and she also does the same thing to her yard. This is very common in the South. You didn't have grass in the yard. It was bare dirt, because that way you could see the snakes and the chiggers and ticks and things. And he says, about once a week, Mama done the same thing to the yard, splashing, sweeping, running away chickens, sweeping again, sometimes sprinkling white sand she got from Kimball Branch, till the yard looked smooth as a piece of white twill cloth that had been washed and ironed. That day when the black car stopped in front of the house and the 2 men in uniforms got out, my heart sunk right to the soles of my feet. It was November of 1943, and you didn't see many cars then because of the gas rationing, even on the big road. And on our little gravel road, you could go half a day and not see a vehicle pass, except for the school bus. That car could not mean any good. As it stopped there on Mama's swept yard beside the boxwood, those 2 men walked across the ground she had swept so carefully, and I wished I could close my eyes and make them go away. We had read in the paper about 2 men coming to deliver bad news from the war. It made me cold in the belly to see them, and then it made me mad. I wanted to fling open the kitchen door and tell them to go away. They had no business coming on us all of a sudden like this. I wanted to tell them to get back in that black car and drive back to town or some army base or Washington, D.C., or wherever they'd come from. They knocked on the kitchen door, and when I opened it, the taller one said, is Mr. Hank Richards here? No, he ain't, I said. The truth was, Papa was out cutting firewood on the Squirrel Hill with my brother Melvin. Is Ms. Richards here? The second man said. He took off his army cap and put it under his arm. No, I'll see, I said, trying to think of some way to keep Mama from having to see them. But the other man took off his cap and looked past me. I turned and see Mama standing right behind me in the light from the door. Ma'am, I'm awfully sorry to be the one to bring you this news, he said, and handed Mama a tan envelope. Mama held the envelope a minute without opening it, then handed it to me. As I ripped open the paper and looked at the telegram, I told myself this was a mistake. We'd read in the paper about men reported killed who later turned up wounded in a hospital or lost from the unit. The telegram was words printed on paper ribbons pasted to the page. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Richards, it is with profound regret I report your son, Troy Richards, serial number 34119284, lost in the crash of a B-17 heavy bomber on November 10, 1943, near the village of Eye in East Anglia. Stop. A grateful nation mourns the loss of your son, whose sacrifice for his country will never be forgotten. I read the words glued to the page to Mama, and she just stared at the door like she didn't see nothing. "Ma'am, if there's anything we can do for you, just let us know," the tall man said. But Mama had already turned away from him. I thought she was going back into the fire in the living room, but she didn't. Instead, she walked to the far side of the kitchen and sat down on the chair by the bread safe. The two men said more things. They talked real gentle, like they was truly sad. I asked again if there was anything they could do. I reckon it was what they'd done every day, going around delivering those telegrams and telling people how sorry they was. Finally, they said a letter would be coming in the mail, along with a box of Troy's personal effects. And then they put on their caps and walked slow back to the car, praying away. You know, last week I got an email from a man in the military who had just read this novel, and he said when he read that passage, he thought of one of his friends in the military who had the job of delivering telegrams to families when their son or daughter had been killed, I guess in Afghanistan or Iraq. And he said his friend said that in every case, the first question the relative said was, "When will the insurance check be coming?" And I thought about that, and it sounds kind of cynical, but think about it. I mean, somebody has just delivered devastating news to you, and you don't want to go to pieces in front of these strangers. I mean, you've got to say something to them, and they've said there will be an insurance, settlement coming. So it's a kind of an obvious thing. I mean, what do you think? Well, when will it be coming? I mean, you don't. We don't like to express our grief, right, to strangers. Somebody in a uniform you've never seen before. So I think that his story didn't mean exactly what it seems to mean at first. Well, the second passage I'm going to read to you is a couple of paragraphs where Annie is talking about the experience of the Great Depression. Now, I, of course, don't remember this. It was before I was born. It was long before you were born. But I grew up hearing people talk about the Great Depression. My mother graduated from high school in 1930. And none of the men in her family could get a job. And she got a job working in the dime store for $9 a week, 6 days a week, $1.50 a day. And that's what the family lived on for years until her younger brother got into the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a little bit like the Army, but you got $30 a month, and they sent 25 of that back to the family. But I'll just read a couple of very short passages where she's talking about the shock of the Great Depression. These are people out in the country. They don't know very much about Wall Street and finance. She says, I don't reckon anybody could see the Depression coming on, unless it was the preachers. Preachers kept saying the world was coming to an end, or coming to a terrible punishment for the sins that people had done. It was a terrible time of bootlegging, gangsters, wild parties in the cities, girls that cut off nearly all their hair and acted like they'd gone crazy, wearing lipstick and rouge and smoking cigarettes in public. But preachers talk that way, don't they? Preachers always see doom and tribulation. That's how they get people to come up to the altar and get saved and join their church and give their money to the collection. They get them scared, and then they keep them scared. Ironically, this woman actually marries a preacher. She can be very tough on them now. But nobody I know could tell what was going to happen when we heard the stock market way up north had crashed and people jumped out of windows. I thought a stock market was a place where they sold horses and cattle. It sounded like a whole building that had burned and fell down. I was in my last year of high school, and everybody seemed to be talking about the Wall Street panic. Papa said Wall Street wasn't about horses and cattle at all. That stock was about money invested in business. He said the whole problem was about debt and about people that owed more than they was worth. But the world had changed. And nobody guessed at first how much it had changed. The first thing that happened was that all the money disappeared. It was like one day there was plenty of money, and then the next day it was all gone. I never was able to tell where it all went. Had somebody took all the money and hid it? Did the government and the bankers all call the money in? Was it buried somewhere under a government building? Or was all the paper money burned up? I just didn't see how so many thousands of dollars, millions of dollars could disappear overnight. You could see the buildings and cars and things that had been bought, but there would never be any more bought because there wasn't any more money. Now it hurts a woman to have to cut back and live without money and keep wearing the same clothes month after month until the cloth gets frayed and threadbare. A woman worries about what she's going to put on the table the next day and what she'll wear to church or graduation or to a funeral. But a man that can't find work and don't have money to buy groceries or put in a collection plate at church or buy gas for his truck is humble and ashamed. I seen Papa come home after he looked for work, and he looked gray. You could see the ton of worry and doubt he carried on his shoulders. It was a blessing that the land had finally been paid for. A man that don't have a job or no money won't look you in the eye. He looks at the yard or off to the side. A man that can't find work stays away from the house. He can't sit on the porch resting as usual. He tries to look busy, cutting weeds around the barn or hog pen, patching up harness, oiling his plows, sharpening his tools. As the conditions got worse, Papa took to hunting squirrels in season and fishing for trout in the river. Annie, the narrator, is very shy, actually, though she has a temper and a sharp tongue, and is very much afraid of getting up and speaking to people. She has stage fright, but she discovers that she can act in front of people. And you know, they're famous actors in this way. I mean, they're very much afraid to get up in front of an audience as themselves, but once they're in a role, they don't mind getting in front of the cameras or the lights on stage. And the next very short passage I'll read to you is about Annie, who stars in the school play when she's a senior. Now, she's just a country girl, but she wins this part. Gets to star in the play, which is a real trashy melodrama about a woman who's a terrible flirt and breaks the heart of all the boys, and then she falls in love and gets her heart broken and dies. Annie says, "Now, I've never been on a stage in front of so many people before, and I admit I was a little nervous as the big night approached. I know nearly the whole school, families and people from the community would come. Papa would drive us to the school in his new Model A truck, with Mama and me in the front and the boys riding in the back. When I got to school and went backstage to put on my dress, I could hear the crowd on the other side of the curtain, and my hands trembled a little. My costume was a kind of sundress with low shoulders and a short skirt, almost short as shorts. I swallowed and suddenly felt so scared I wanted to tell Mr. Oswald I was sick or just run away into the night. The other kids in the play started coming in and putting on their costumes, and it was too late. I prayed that if I could get through the play without making a complete fool of myself, I'd never act again. Some people said the theater was a sin, and maybe I was being punished for taking part. Before the curtain went up, I was trembling, and it felt like my feet had turned to ice. But as the curtain lifted and the lights hit my face, it was like a weight was lifted off. I opened my mouth to say the first lines and stepped forward into my part. Nobody in the audience could see me. All they could see was Priscilla. It was like I stepped through some kind of wall and was in contact with the people out there in the dark. I said my lines with all the feeling and meaning I could give them. From the first, the audience hung on every word and every move I made. Jason forgot his lines once, and Mr. Oswald prompted him from behind the drapery, but it didn't make no difference. The audience laughed at things that was funny and kept quiet most of the time. There wasn't even much coffee. In the last scene, when I died of a broke heart, Jason was supposed to carry me off stage. I told him at every rehearsal to carry me with my head toward the audience. For if I was turned the other way, wearing the short skirts, people could see all the way up to my bloomers. Well, we got through the play, and the audience liked us. They even clapped sometimes after a scene, a night special. So when I died, Jason picked me up. But I reckon he was nervous and forgot and held me so my legs was toward the audience. And my skirt was pulled up even higher. Even though I was supposed to be dead, I reached out and pushed my skirt down as far as I could. And the audience started laughing. And then they roared. Maybe they thought that was in the play, for they started clapping like they would beat their hands to rags and bones. Mr. Oswald was beaming as we come off the stage. Now, Mr. Oswald was a very shy man. He'd blush even talking to a class. But I reckon he was so thrilled to have the play over and to have such a big crowd and such applause, he wasn't hardly at himself. As soon as Jason put me down, Mr. Oswald ran over and hugged me and kissed me on the cheek. There was tears in his eyes, and he said, "You're wonderful, wonderful." But the clapping continued, and we had to go out on the stage and take a bow. Now, one of the themes of The Road from Gap Creek is love. It's really a kind of double love story. It's the story of Sharon, the fiancée of Troy, who was killed in the war, and the story of the narrator Annie and Muir, who's courted her for years, and they finally marry. And in that sense, this novel is a sequel to two other novels, The Truest Pleasure and This Rock, which are the story of the Powell family. And the two families are united, so this really is sort of the capstone novel. But Annie likes to talk about, she likes to philosophize. She has lots of opinions. And I'll read a couple of paragraphs where she's talking about love. She says, "I don't reckon anybody knows what draws a man and woman together. It must be some kind of sixth sense, something nobody understands. I didn't think of Sharon as especially good looking at all. She was kind of skinny and dark, like she had been out in the sun all summer. She had brown eyes and a kind of round face. Her hands looked a little too big for the size of her arms. I thought I knew what attracted men, but now I'm not so sure. Sharon was slim and well-made. That was all. I hope you hear the jealousy in her voice." But all that weekend, Troy opened the door for her and pointed out things to her. He was usually friendly and always polite, but this was different. It surprised me and pleased me to see love take hold of him and Sharon. I guess I was a little jealous too, for he paid more attention and less to me. You could see the love growing in their eyes when they looked at each other, when they stood close together, when Troy took her hand to help her down the steps, through a fence. To watch somebody fall in love helps us see the world in a new and better light. Most days are just for work and waiting, getting along from hour to hour. But love puts everything in a new brightness and sets the world at a new angle. People in love may look the same, but if you watch them, they seem different too. Willing to take some risks, see things they haven't noticed before. And I will conclude with one short poem from Tuah. In fact, it's the last poem. As I was saying to the class earlier, I'm very interested in Native Americans and Indians. I've studied them for a long time, and especially in my research for my nonfiction books. And one of the great things about doing historical research is you turn up great ideas for poems. And this idea came from studying the Muskogees, the Creek Indians in Georgia and Alabama, who built these great mounds along the rivers. And typically, Indians would never tell white people what their rituals were about. White people had to speculate. This is called Mound Builders, and it's really a poem about family and about heritage. The Creeks of frontier Georgia said they made the mounds along the streams for sanctuaries during floods. When rivers spread across the plain, they climbed atop the fashioned hills until the inundation passed. But later studies would reveal the elevations packed with bones and grave goods, spears and arrowheads, ceramics, gems, totemic signs, and favorite beads. It seems the Creeks deposited their dead, their kin, in ceremonial heaps that took a dozen generations to attain the height desired. They may have sought a refuge from the floods on those acclivities, but what they stood atop and slept atop for safety was the sacred dirt and relics of their clan, the signs and symbols of their hearth, beliefs and arts and holy bundles too, as all of us rely and must on our traditions and the deep ancestral memories and ways to bear us up and get us through the deadly and uncertain days, sustaining breath and sight and hope on residue and legacy of those beloved who came before and watch us from the glittering stars. When the Indians believed the stars were their ancestors looking down at them. I will stop there. Thank you very much. Do you have questions and answers? Is that a part of this? Sure. If you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. My students will tell you, give me a pulpit, and I'll go talk a long time about writing, history. No question.
I have a question. There's not another. So you're multifaceted in your talents and your writing, and your fiction. In the fiction that I've read, it tends to be typically about ordinary people. The nonfiction biographies are about major figures in American history. Have you ever found yourself drawn to write about some of those figures in fiction, or maybe you have?
I have actually written one short story about Boone, and General Daniel Morgan appears as a character in Brave Enemies, a great victor of the Battle of Calhoun, who's a relative, it turns out. I didn't know that when I read the book, but we are distantly related, have a common ancestor. But I thought about that often. I would love to write fiction where you could incorporate figures like Jefferson, maybe, or Ben Franklin. Some of my favorite diplomats, like John Quincy Adams or John Hay, in fiction. But I think one advantage of moving around from fiction to nonfiction to poetry is you don't get writer's block. I mean, you hit a block on one, you can move on to the next one and work at it. I sometimes half seriously say, if you fail at one thing, you try another one. You fail at poetry, you try short stories. You fail at short stories, you try novels. You fail at novels, you try a biography. I don't know what you try after that. Maybe playwriting. You had a hand up.
Yeah. I'm in a creative writing class right now, and one of the things we talk about a lot is writing revisions, both quantity and quality of revisions. So how would you say you handle the revision process?
Well, revision is absolutely essential to all good writing. Really, it is where you often do your best work. And I think the more you write, the more you appreciate revising. When I was young, I loved the rush of the first draft. That was so exciting. But as I wrote more and got older, I came to appreciate having that second chance and third chance to improve it. Earlier in the class, I was talking about Jefferson rewriting and rewriting everything he did. I don't know how many drafts he did of the Declaration of Independence, but there's a lot of them. He kept compressing and compressing and sharpening. They say that the first draft is the courtship and the revision is the marriage, something like that. I mean, that's where you really have to. And it's wonderful to be able to improve something, to go over it and to make a sentence live. Because when you read something, you can tell if the writing is alive. Sentence by sentence, something is being done. You're opening up a fictive space or an intellectual space. historical space by the details and by the sentences. And it helps to know that you start with nothing, a blank page, a blank screen, and you create a reality one sentence at a time. But yes, I think revision is delightful. I mean, you go back and turn a good sentence into a great sentence. Just by taking out a word or adding another word. I can remember in an early poem I was trying to find the word that expressed how a brackish spring behind a church looked compared with a very clear spring that was near it, a very clear spring. And then one day I came on the word ungodly. And it was just perfect because it was behind the church, an ungodly spring compared to the clear one. Of course, the ungodly spring was the interesting one. It was more complicated. But yeah, it's so much fun when you have a draft to start going back and tightening the sentences. And in the case of fiction or nonfiction, deepening it, putting in the second thought and the third thought that didn't occur to you when you were writing the first draft. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll think of, the exact word I wanted and I couldn't find then. But to be able to have that leisure, an actor doesn't have that once they get on the stage or in front of the camera. I mean, they do scenes, but if you're a dancer, you have to get up and do it. But a writer is in the privacy of the study. You have a chance to clean up those mistakes and sharpen the writing. Other questions? Yes?
Would you describe your style as being sort of like an Americana style? And if so, is there like a group of contemporaries or even, past authors that you see yourself in school with, or sort of as a flag bearer of this Americana style?
Well, by that I think it's written in something that sounds like dialect, right? Somebody using double negatives and expressions. It's a part of the American tradition of fiction. It's true in other countries too, but I think it's even more. For us, to a great extent, it comes out of Huckleberry Finn, and believe it or not, I mean, before that, this explosion of American imagination in the 1850s, beginning with Moby Dick, which has all kinds of voices, including an enormous amount of slang. He's a sailor, after all. Of course, he cleaned it up. He didn't really use sailor's slang, but I would say it begins probably with Herman Melville. And I believe, though no literary historian has said this, that when Walt Whitman was beginning to write What Became Leaves of Grass, about 1852-53, he had read Moby Dick. And that tremendous fantasia, verbal imagination, is contagious. I think it had they were born the same year, by the way, but Melville got started earlier in a way than Whitman. But American writing, to a great extent, comes out of the vernacular and out of the storytelling tradition, whether it's Southern, whether it's African American, whether it's Irish, whatever. But the great masterpiece in the dialect, the first one, is Huckleberry Finn. It's such an extraordinary book. It's different every time you read it. I mean, when you start reading it again, you think you've never read it before. I mean, you forget just how good it is, sentence by sentence, line by line. Twain has such a perfect ear. It comes out in Faulkner in the fourth section of The Sound of the Fury. That same shock of recognition. I mean, nobody can write that well. Nobody can get dialect that well, but Faulkner could. And many other writers, beginning with Richard Wright. And you have this great tradition of Mississippi writing, you go Welty, Richard Wright, Faulkner, Shelby Foote, one after another. There's always been a question, we were talking about this at dinner, why so many great writers come out of Mississippi, or North Carolina for that matter, often considered poor or not best education. But the short answer, when interviewers ask me why there's so many great writers from North Carolina, I say because there ain't nothing else to do down there. But, It's the storytelling tradition. Then Eudora Welty's great answer to an interviewer, she thought about it for a while, and she said, maybe we have more to explain. Eudora always said the perfect thing. She was remarkably articulate. One more question? Thank you very much.